a few things to cover here before we get into the chat. Helio Castroneves, four-time Indy 500 winner, going to run the Daytona 500. Austin Cindric's going to run the Rolex 24. The charter thing has been confirmed by Bob Pockrass that you can, some teams can have four, but they've maxed the rest of the teams out at three. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And I finally will jump into Noah Gragson, basically running the same team with a different number at front row, since I haven't covered that yet either. But let's jump to Trackhouse and the Project 91 car. Helio Castroneves is going to run that car at the Daytona 500, which gives Trackhouse one American driver, one Mexican driver, one Australian driver, and then, of course, one Brazil driver. So international team being fielded there by Trackhouse in the Daytona 500. Also in the 24 hours, they've got an international team as well, which is pretty cool. Always cool to see NASCAR cars in that. But like I said, Helio Castroneves, a four-time Indy 500 winner, and it's really cool to see him get this opportunity because if you remember a few years ago in SRX, when he won a race over there in SRX, I think he was promised by Don Hawk that he would give him a shot at the Daytona 500. Now, that never materialized. Of course, SRX had some problems, so obviously they couldn't get that figured out. But it is good to finally see Helio Castroneves get his opportunity or chance at the Daytona 500. And he joins a crew of other people who are going to attempt the Daytona 500. Of course, one being Martin Truex Jr. with Tricon Garage, allegedly, because that's the only apparently Toyota team that Joe Gibbs, it's going to be a Joe Gibbs car, but that's the only team that Joe Gibbs can kind of funnel a car into, since they've already got four chartered cars, which once again we'll get to here in just a minute. But Martin Truex Jr., he's going to make a start there. Last week, of course, we got Mike Wallace. He announced that he is going to run for Carl Long, so we'll see if he can make the show. Then you got BJ McLeod out there. He is going to run probably in that 78 car, his own team, so wouldn't be surprised to see him. And it hasn't been officially announced yet, but everybody pretty much has come to the conclusion that the 84 car of Jimmy Johnson is going to run this thing as well. So you got Jimmy Johnson in the mix too. And then we've got some wild cards out there that could possibly run. We don't know if they're going to run or not, but RCR usually does run a 33 car. They haven't made any announcements about that yet, but I would imagine Austin Hill would be in that if they run it, and some type of sponsorship over there on the 33. Or maybe they put somebody else in it, but I wouldn't be surprised if RCR ran the 33. Rick Ware's 15. That's another number out there sort of hanging out. If Ford wants to get another driver into or at least attempting to get into the Daytona 500, it would be an unchartered car, because obviously Rick Ware Racing leasing the other charter to RFK for this season, but they could run, like they're sort of their all-star or whatever. It's put somebody in the 15. It would be essentially be another Roush car. And then you got the Amerivet 50, it used to be the money team or whatever. That 50 car, could they get somebody to come out there and run that 50 car? Who would they put in that? Would that materialize? So hard to say. And then I don't know if I mentioned him or yet, but JJ Yaley, I think he's going to run for New York Racing in the 44. So you got the JJ Yaley going out there for the 44. So all kinds of basically open entries for the Daytona 500. So qualifying will matter a little bit, even though most of the charter teams, you already know that they're in because they have a charter. And speaking of the Rolex 24, because I mentioned that earlier, Austin Cindric is going to run with Team Multimatic, the Ford Multimatic team. He's done that before. It's always good when the NASCAR drivers, and like I mentioned earlier, Trackhouse has a team over there in the Rolex 24. So the Rolex 24, always fun to see what the NASCAR guys can do over there in that. So that's always a fun thing to follow that I like doing. But I mentioned Martin Truex Jr. couldn't run under Joe Gibbs because of the charter thing. So let's just get that one out of the way, because that is the poll question. How did I word the poll question? Is grandfathering Hendrick and Gibbs to have 4 charters while everyone else is limited to 3 good for the sport, bad for the sport, won't matter either way, or more charters, more problems? So Bob Pockrass basically confirmed that the new charter agreement limits teams to 3 charters, but they grandfathered in Joe Gibbs Racing and Hendrick Motorsport. So it begs the question, is that fair to the other drivers? So there's 2 sides to that coin. So let's just address that first, and then I'll give sort of my take on it. One side of the coin is it's not fair. They shouldn't be allowed to keep those 4 teams because you get more basically information because you've got an extra car out there. You've got more money to pool into the account because you have an extra car out there. So those are going to be the competitive advantage issues that a lot of teams will be arguing. And Ford is going to have a good argument too because Ford doesn't technically have a 4-car team, whereas Toyota and Chevrolet do have a 4-car, a super team, I guess, if you want to call it something like that. Although you could consider Penske a 4-car team because I feel like the Wood Brothers ride is basically just a 4th Penske car. But on paper, Ford people can make the argument. And I'm going to get into the Roush thing that happened in the mid 2000s. Don't worry, we're going to touch on that here in just a minute too, as far as these charters go. So for the other teams, they're going to scream that that's an unfair advantage, unfair competitive advantage, I would imagine, or the fans at least will scream that. But there's other way of looking at it too, right? So from the other side of looking at it, you can say, well, if these teams wanted to run 4 teams, how come they weren't running 4 teams before the charters became a thing? So, and the reasons for that would be it's expensive to run extra cars. They couldn't find the sponsorship money, so on and so forth. It becomes an expense issue. So that's going to be the other side of the argument. If they wanted to run 4 teams, they should have been running 4 teams. So that is if it's a existing team that has been there for a long time, like say a RCR or Wood Brothers, whoever you want to mention that only has 2 charters or so, you can make that argument. So that is a fair argument to make on the other side. However, and where I stand on this is if you're a Trackhouse, if you're a Legacy Motor Club, if you're a 2311, a new up and coming team, this does sort of stunt your growth. So if you wanted to be a 4-car operation, I think when they made whatever they call the big complex, the 2311 built, I think they had a 4-bay garage. So I do think at one point they were at least planning to have a 4-car or a 4-charter team. It does stunt that growth if they ever wanted to do that. So from that aspect, for the new teams that did want to expand like that, like a Trackhouse, I would imagine probably wanted 4 cars at some point as well. It does stunt their growth and it hurts them wanting to grow and be one of those Hendrick Motorsports type cars and things like that. So the way I look at it is, and this is where I'm going to take it back to the Roush thing in the mid 2000s. Remember when Roush was running 5 teams and NASCAR said you can only run 4 teams? We're going to give you X amount of years to get rid of this 5th team. In my opinion, that is really the only fair thing to do here because you can't have these teams that are already super teams have the advantage of more information and stuff like that. So you got to give them X amount of years to get rid of that 4th charter, and then everybody has 3 charters. To me, that's the only fair thing to do. Now, I don't know how the charter was written up. The only thing that Bob Pocker said is in the new charter agreement, they're grandfathered in. He didn't mention if there was a time limit on it or anything like that. But to me, that's the only fair thing to do because that's what they did to Roush in the mid 2000s. So that would be somewhat consistent. Not that NASCAR has to be consistent. NASCAR does what NASCAR wants, at least right now. But grandfather them in for an X amount of time, and you've got X amount of time to get rid of those charters. And then everybody's a 3-car team, and it's fair for everybody. But that's my thoughts on the matter, my thoughts on the situation. But yeah, I just don't. To me, I don't think it's a good thing to have 2 teams that have an extra car advantage, regardless of the arguments you make. Overall, I just don't think it's a good thing for the future of the sport. Overall, you can't give 2 teams an advantage like that. So I do think they need to grandfather them in for X amount of time and give them time to get through those contracts and all that, and then they need to relinquish those charters, and that frees up charters for other people that want to come into the sport. So. Yeah, that's that. And then the other thing I hadn't covered, a little bit of an old story, but I hadn't covered it yet. Noah Gragson and Drew Blickensderfer are getting back together. That's going to be the number 4 team over there at Front Row Motorsports. So basically the same team they had last year where they had, I think, 1 top 5, 7 top 10s, and 16 top 15s, whereas his half a season with Legacy Motor Club, obviously Noah Gragson didn't do as well over there at Legacy, but he does have some chemistry with Drew Blickensderfer. I think they got some stuff done last year, and now they can continue on that momentum because it's not just Drew Blickensderfer, but it's also going to be the entirety of that former 10 team basically going over there and being the now 4 team over there for Front Row Motorsports. So I think that's a big move and a good catch and pickup for them. So yeah, that's the news. Got through that. So let's see what you guys want to talk about.